I never thought I'd be standing outside the gate like a forgotten soul. Not after all those years of service, not after the battles I still carry with me. Not on paper, but in the cold scars that greet me every morning. All I wanted was to lay down a flower. Just that. A single white lily already beginning to wilt for the brother who once dragged me from the rubble more than 2 decades ago. Today was his funeral. A 4-star general, honored with every ounce of ceremony this country can offer a hero. Only. No one in that crowd knew who I was. And then, the ceremony paused. Among the officials, the bugle, and the honor guard, another general stepped down from the stage. He didn't say a word. He didn't care about the cameras. He walked straight toward the gate, where I was standing, and raised his hand in salute. Because sometimes the ones who truly understand the value of goodbye are the ones who survive to carry it in their hearts. I walked slowly, cane in hand, up the red dirt road that led to the hill. The intercity bus had dropped me off 3/4 of a mile back. The autumn wind blew through the rows of American flags lining the iron fence, sounding like the long sigh of this nation. I gripped the white lily tighter, wilted now, the only thing I brought to say goodbye. My name is Walter Briggs, once of the 10th Airborne Battalion, back when soldiers lived and died for each other, not for the insignia on their collar. Today I came to say farewell to an old brother-in-arms, the man the world now knows as General Marshall A. Decker. But to me, he was always just Deck, the guy who hauled me out of the fire in Kandahar when my leg was no longer whole. I had no invitation, no medals glinting on my chest. Just an old uniform with frayed shoulders, hand-sewn seams, pressed flat the night before. Truth is, I never needed any medals. I didn't come for applause. I just came to say a final word. As I approached the gate, a young man in a dress uniform stepped in front of me. Fresh-faced, probably just out of protocol school. Restricted area, sir. Military funeral, 4-star general. No badge, no entry. He didn't even look at me. His eyes skimmed over my faded uniform and turned away like I was just another shadow. I stood still. Didn't argue. Didn't beg. Just gave a slight nod. The young soldier turned and resumed his post while I remained there, just outside the black iron gate, looking in. Rows of chairs aligned in perfect symmetry, dress uniforms gleaming, medals catching the pale Virginia sunlight, camera lenses panning across every official face, the flag folded with precision, everything by the book, exactly what a hero's funeral should look like, except for one thing. That hero used to be my friend. And I, the man who once carried him out of a battlefield, wasn't worthy to stand beside his coffin. So I stood, in silence, outside the gate, between a country I once swore to protect with my life and a gathering that had forgotten some soldiers never left the battlefield because they carried it inside them forever. I didn't want trouble. I didn't want to disrupt anything. All I wanted was to bow my head, lay the flower down on the ground, and whisper, "Deck, I made it." But this era no longer has room for what once was. For names not on guest lists, for scars not logged, in official files, and all I had left was the flower in my hand. I stood outside those cold black gates for what felt like an eternity. The wind rustled the trees overhead, painting the sky in shifting tones of gray and gold. Beyond the fence, bugles cried their rehearsed notes, precise, polished, sterile. Each sound a reminder that this was no longer about brotherhood. It was about protocol, and I didn't belong. The young guard had gone back to his post, eyes straight ahead, not once glancing back at the old man he had turned away. I don't blame him. He was following orders, probably doing exactly what he was trained to do. But there was something hollow about it all, something that rang false, like a salute without a soul. Inside, the chairs were filled. Generals, senators, reporters with expensive lenses. Faces I'd only seen on television, shaking hands at press, briefings or standing behind podiums. They were all there to honor Marshal Decker, the hero, the commander, the symbol. But I wasn't there for the symbol. I was there for the man. The man who once gave me half his canteen under a burning Afghan sun when my leg was bleeding and my hope was nearly gone. The man who made me laugh at death with a dumb joke about canned chili. The man who, when the dust and gunfire cleared, sat beside me in a field hospital, holding my hand as I screamed through morphine. I owe him my life. And I wasn't going to leave, gate or no gate, so I stayed. Not out of defiance, but out of duty. One final duty. I took a slow breath and let my eyes wander the hilltops. The cemetery at Quantico is a beautiful place. Peaceful, silent, sacred. Rows upon rows of white headstones stretch across the hills. Like frozen waves. So many names. So many stories that would never be told again. And yet there I stood, holding one more story that hadn't ended yet. People passed me as if I were invisible. A few photographers, a driver in a black suit, an aide in heels, eyes glued to a tablet. No one asked who I was. No one paused. They were too busy preparing the next camera angle or rehearsing the next line of praise. That's when it hit me. This funeral, it wasn't just for Decker. It was for all of us, wasn't it? The ones who made it back with more scars than skin. The ones who weren't heroes in the newspapers but were damn sure heroes in the dirt. And yet, here I was, blocked, at the gate like an intruder, like a ghost too stubborn to rest. I looked down at the lily in my hand. The edges were browned now, fragile, like me. You'd think after 40 years, after all the blood and grit, I'd be used to being overlooked, forgotten. But some things never stop stinging, and standing on the outside of a funeral for the only man who ever understood me. That stung worse than anything I'd faced in war. I took a step back. I thought maybe I should just place the flower at the gate and walk away, leave quietly, like they wanted me to, like they expected me to. But something in my chest said no. Deck wouldn't want that. He'd want me to stand. So I stood, tall as I could, back straight, shoulders square, because I wasn't just there for him. I was there for every soldier who came home and didn't know where they belonged anymore. For every vet who watched the world move on without them. For every name etched in stone but not in memory. And right as I was about to speak, just a whisper, maybe a prayer, I noticed something shift inside the crowd. It was subtle at first. Movement near the front, heads turning, a pause in the music. The ripple of unease like a wave cutting through calm waters. Then I saw him. A figure in full-dress blues, stepping away from the flag-draped coffin. Slow. Deliberate. He didn't look at the cameras. Didn't speak to the aide beside him. He walked straight toward the gate, straight toward me, and the world held its breath. The wind stilled, every rustling leaf, every whisper of fabric, every tap of shoe on pavement inside those gates. It all stopped, and at that moment, I forgot how to breathe. There he was, General Alexander Reed. The man they said had taken over CENTCOM before he was 50. The one who'd spoken at the White House, dined with presidents, carried 3 stars longer than some soldiers carried a rifle. And now, a 4th star gleamed on each shoulder as he walked, hat tucked under one arm, his eyes locked on mine. Blinked, unsure if this was some memory rising up from the dust of time, or if I was still standing in the present, outside the gate like a ghost. But he wasn't a memory. He was real, and he was coming straight for me. The young guard who'd turned me away looked up, startled. His lips parted, uncertain. You could see it, the sudden weight of realizing this was not part of the plan. He shifted his stance, as if to intercept, then thought better of it and stepped aside. General Reed didn't speak, didn't break stride, and as he got closer, I saw it in his face. Something heavy, something personal. He stopped exactly 2 feet from the gate, and for a long second, he just looked at me. Not like the others had, not like the guard had. He looked like he knew me. I didn't salute. I didn't speak. I didn't move a muscle. I was just a retired paratrooper with bad knees and a fading uniform, standing under the weight of something bigger than ceremony. He finally spoke. Briggs. That was all he said. My name, not sir, not mister, just Briggs. Like we were back in the dirt. Like nothing had changed. My throat tightened. I swallowed hard, tried to nod, but it came out more like a shiver. Sir? I managed, though my voice cracked on the word. He looked down at the lily in my hand, then back, at me. And when he spoke again, it was low, quiet, but sharp as a folded flag. He saved your life, didn't he? I nodded once. Twice, actually, he gave a small smile. Not out of humor, out of respect. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out something small and black. A badge, or a pass. I couldn't tell. He didn't hand it to the guard. He didn't wave it around. He turned to the young sergeant and said calmly but firmly, "Open the gate." "But sir, he's not on the—" I said, "Open the gate," and like that, the latch clicked. The metal gate that had stood between me and my goodbye slid open, slow and heavy, like a drawbridge across a canyon of years. General Reed didn't motion for me to enter. He stepped aside and saluted. That's when I nearly broke, because this wasn't just a general opening a gate. This was a brother acknowledging another, a commander honoring a story that no record had kept. I stood as tall as I could, then gave him the sharpest salute I had left in me. My shoulder ached, my spine screamed, but I held it like I had something left to prove, and you know what? At that moment, I did. I walked through the gate. The gravel crunched beneath my boots. Every step felt like a step back through time, past ranks and medals, past paperwork and lists, into the dirt and blood and loyalty that bound men like Deck and me together forever. People inside turned to look. Some whispered. Others just stared. They didn't recognize me. Why would they? I wasn't a politician. I wasn't a face in the press kit. I was just the man Deck pulled out of hell, and today I came to return the favor by standing for him when it counted. As I approached the casket, I didn't look left or right. I didn't acknowledge the cameras or the crowd. I just stopped, knelt down, and laid the lily at the foot of the flag. Then I placed my hand on the corner of that coffin and whispered, "I made it, Deck. You didn't think I would, but I did." I stayed there for a long while. No one interrupted me, not even the general, because at that moment they all understood. You don't need clearance to honor a brother. You just need to show up. I didn't cry. Not then. I just stood there, my hand resting on the corner of the coffin, fingers trembling slightly against the smooth wood and the tight-folded flag that covered it. It wasn't the first time I'd touched a coffin draped in, stars and stripes. But it was the first time it felt like I was touching my own reflection, my past, my pain, my brother. Behind me, I could feel them staring. The high brass. The aides with clipboards. The photographers whose hands hovered awkwardly over camera shutters. For once, no one moved. No one dared. It was like the air itself had thickened, heavy with something unspoken. I could feel it in my bones. Respect. The kind you can't fake with a speech or a medal. The kind you earn when you bleed beside someone and survive just long enough to remember them. When I finally stepped back from the casket, the crowd didn't resume. There was no music, no folded script, just silence. until the general moved. General. Reed walked slowly back toward the podium, his eyes scanning every person in that crowd. His presence was like a signal, and one by one, they began to rise. It started with a colonel, then a major, then a row of soldiers in full-dress blues. I didn't know their names, they didn't know mine, but they stood. They stood because I had stood, not for myself. Not for recognition, but for the one man we were all supposed to be there for. And somehow, through all the rehearsed ceremony and planned logistics, it took one unscheduled old paratrooper to bring that truth back to the surface. I moved to the side, found an empty seat in the very back row, far from the press, far from the generals, but no one told me to move. No one asked me to explain myself. They didn't need to, because the salutes hadn't stopped. As the honor guard returned to their formation, as the chaplain took a deep breath and resumed his eulogy, I saw them. Dozens of them. Old men in faded uniforms, scattered throughout the back edges of the service. Most had arrived quiet, unnoticed, like me. Vietnam vets, Gulf War boys, some maybe even from Iraq or the early days in Afghanistan. We were the forgotten ranks. The ones not on the guest list, but now they stood with me, a brotherhood without clearance, a silent army in the shadows. As the bugler raised his trumpet for taps, I saw something I hadn't expected. General Reed remained standing, his hand over his heart. But as the notes rang out across the hills, he slowly turned and looked at us. The men in the back. The ones who had not come for politics or pageantry, but for truth. And then he did something no one saw coming. He saluted. Not the coffin, not the flag, but us. Directly, unflinchingly, a full, formal, regulation salute held long and steady. A gesture that cut deeper than any medal ever could. It hit me then, what Deck must have told him. Somewhere along the line, sometime between stars and wars, Deck must have kept our stories alive. Told someone. Told him about that day in the mountains. About me. Because you don't salute a ghost unless you believe he still carries the fight inside him. My throat tightened. My hands curled around the cane resting beside my boot, and I gave it back, one final salute. My arm is stiff, my shoulder is screaming, my heart is steady. One last time, not for glory, but for memory. And in that graveyard filled with white, stones and grieving families and headlines waiting to be written, something changed. No one clapped. No one cheered. But they knew. They knew this funeral had just become more than protocol, more than parade. It had become sacred, because for one moment, rank didn't matter. Politics didn't matter. Uniforms, ribbons, guest lists. None of it mattered. What mattered was that someone came back. Someone remembered, and someone stood. As the final note of taps faded into the wind, my mind drifted, far from the polished rows of marble and starched uniforms, back to the grit, heat, and chaos of a place the official speeches never mentioned. You won't find it on a memorial plaque. It wasn't some campaign with a name the press could pronounce. No documentary ever rolled footage of it. But to the few of us who were there, that ridge in the Afghan mountains was as real as the blood in our boots. It was 2003. We were pinned down, 4 of us from 10th Airborne, cut off, low on comms, lower on ammo. The fog rolled in from the east like poison, and every ridge had a muzzle flash. I was hit early. Shrapnel caught my right thigh, tore through tendon and muscle like butter. I dropped fast, but I didn't black out. I remember the pain. I remember the dirt in my teeth. And I remember Deck. Not General Decker, not Sir, just Deck. The guy with the busted nose from a bar fight in North Carolina. The one who sang Springsteen in the back of the Humvee like it was Sunday Mass. The one who kept a folded photo of his daughter inside his helmet and touched it before every op. He could have run. Hell, any sane man would have pulled back and called for air support. That was the smart move, the safe move, but he didn't. He dragged me 50 yards uphill, bullets kicking dirt inches from his boots, both of us covered in blood. He screamed the whole time, not out of fear, but to keep me awake. "You, close your eyes, Briggs, and I'll punch your ghost." I still laugh thinking about that. By the time we got over the ridge, both of us were barely alive. But we made it. That ridge became the only line between survival and a flag-draped box. And it was him, his brute stubbornness, his refusal to leave a man behind. That saved me. They never gave him a medal for that. Too messy. Too off the record. But that didn't matter to him. Deck never cared about decorations. He once told me, "I don't want my daughter growing up knowing her dad had to get shot at just to earn respect." What he wanted, what we all wanted, was to come home with our souls intact. The funny thing is, we both made it home, but only one of us ever stopped fighting. Deck went on to become a general, and a damn good one. He cleaned up corruption in 2 bases, rewrote supply chain policy, and never forgot what it meant to be groundside. He kept photos of his old unit in his office, none of us in regulation dress, most of us grinning through broken teeth. And every Christmas, without fail, I'd get a card. Nothing fancy. Just a photo of him and his daughter, handwritten in thick Sharpie. "Still breathing, Briggs. Hope you are too." This year the card didn't come. I should have known then. I should have felt it in my bones, and yet I waited until last week when the newspaper ran the headline, "4-star General Marshall A. Decker dies at 61, state funeral scheduled, no cause listed, no details, just the headline, just the silence." So I packed my things, pressed my uniform, wrapped a lily in cloth, took the first Greyhound I could afford. I didn't call anyone, didn't ask for clearance, because you don't need an invitation to say goodbye to your brother. And that's the truth they never write down. It's not the medals, not the speeches, not the 21-gun salutes. It's the quiet moments, the shared rations, the blood-stained gravel, the way one man hauls another across hell just because he said he would. That's the kind of honor no ceremony can replicate, and it's why I came. Not to be seen, not to be saluted, but to remind the world that somewhere behind every great man they mourn in public, there's someone who remembers what he really was in private. I didn't wait for the crowd to disperse, didn't linger for the handshakes or the reception line or the polite murmurs of, "Thank you for your service." I'd heard enough of that phrase thrown around by people who couldn't name a single base past their zip code. The Deck wouldn't have stayed either. He wasn't much for small talk. I stood slowly, joints protesting, and gave one last look at the casket beneath the folded flag. The white lily lay still, untouched, just as I'd placed it. A soft breeze brushed over it, like a breath from another time. Then I turned and started walking. The gravel crunched beneath my boots with that slow, steady rhythm that only old soldiers know, the march of someone who's carried weight longer than most folks realize, past the back rows. Past the officers in pressed blues who nodded with solemn approval but didn't say a word. Past the aides with their earpieces and schedules scanning for the next media photo op. I wasn't part of their plan. I was just a wrinkle in the fabric of their perfect ceremony, and yet no one tried to stop me now. Funny how respect shifts, isn't it? One moment you're nobody outside the gate. Next, you're the man who reminded them what all those medals actually mean. I reached the main path, the long stretch of blacktop that wound its way down the hill, lined with stone markers and American. Flags flapping in the afternoon wind, rows upon rows. So many names, so many stories are lost to time. I paused halfway down, not from exhaustion, though Lord knows my knees had earned their protests, but because something told me I wasn't done just yet. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, light, hesitant. I turned slowly and saw her, young, early 20s maybe. dressed in a conservative black coat, hair pulled back in a tight bun, heels sinking slightly into the gravel. She clutched a folded program from the funeral in one hand, the edges curled where her fingers had pressed too tightly. At first, I figured she was lost, maybe looking for a ride, or maybe just one of those who couldn't quite process the weight of a military goodbye. But then she spoke. "Excuse me, sir, were you one of his men?" Her voice shook, not out of fear, but out of something raw. Grief, maybe, or disbelief. I couldn't quite tell. I gave a small nod. "A long time ago, before most people in that crowd ever knew his name." She stepped closer. There were tears in her eyes, but she held herself straight, like someone taught to be strong in public. "I'm his daughter," she said quietly. "Emily." My chest tightened. I'd seen her once before, in a photo covered in dirt stuck to the inside of Deck's helmet during that awful Kandahar op. Back then, she'd been barely more than a toddler in pigtails, grinning at the camera with jelly on her cheek. Now she was standing in front of me, all grown and mourning. "I saw what you did," she continued, her voice cracking. "The flower, the salute. You were the only one who looked like you knew him." I nodded again. "I didn't know the general," I said. "I knew the man. The one who carried extra socks for guys who forgot. The one who sat awake all night watching over the wounded, even when he needed rest more than anyone. That's the man I came to see." She covered her mouth with one hand, and for a moment I thought she might fall apart. But she didn't. She straightened her spine like a soldier, just like her father used to. "Thank you," she whispered, "for coming. He never talked much about the war, but I always wondered who he remembered when he stared out the window for hours." I smiled softly. "He remembered us, and we remembered him. That's all that matters now." She looked down at the folded program in her hand and held it out to me. "I think he would have wanted you to have this." I took it gently, fingers brushing the paper like it was something sacred. Then we stood there, two strangers bound not by blood, but by one man's legacy. Eventually, she turned back toward the crowd, and I turned toward the road. As I continued, down the hill, cane tapping gently with each step, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. I didn't feel invisible anymore. I felt seen, not by the cameras, not by the headlines, but by the people who mattered. By the time I reached the bottom of the hill, the wind had picked up again, sharp now, less forgiving. The kind of breeze that cuts through an old man's jacket and reminds him of everything he's lived through, and everyone he's outlived. Paused at the old bench where the city bus had dropped me off that morning. Same spot. Same cracked wood. But I wasn't the same man who'd arrived. I sat slowly, every joint protesting, and leaned forward with my elbows on my knees, letting the quiet settle. The cemetery gate stood behind me now, far enough to blur, but close enough to feel. I didn't turn back. I didn't need to. That part of the story was finished. I took the folded funeral program Emily had given me out of my coat pocket. Ran, a thumb along the embossed lettering. General Marshall A. Decker, husband, father, patriot. There were 4 pages inside. A polished biography. Photos of him shaking hands with foreign dignitaries. Quotes from presidents. Newspaper headlines clipped and clean. Not a single mention of the mountain ridge. Not a single photo of Deck with dirt on his boots or sweat on his collar. And not a word about that freezing morning in Kandahar where he shouted himself horse dragging. A broken paratrooper across the rocks, but I didn't mind. You see, that's the thing they never tell you when you put on the uniform. You're not doing it to be remembered. You're doing it so someone else can forget, can live a life without having to carry the weight you did. Deck understood that. So did I. We weren't meant for the history books. We were meant for the spaces between them, for the moments nobody writes down. The scream over a radio, the grip of a hand in the dark, the quiet promise between men who may never see the sunrise again. I looked out across the field beyond the bench. A father was helping his son fly a kite in the distance. The kid laughed when it caught wind and tugged hard. The father smiled wide and let it go. I watched that moment, so simple, so clean, and I knew Deck would have loved it. He didn't die as a general in my memory. He died as the man who helped make moments like that possible. And maybe that was the point. Not to be remembered by the masses, but to be remembered by the right few. The kind who show up without being asked. The kind who cross state lines on bad knees and old buses. The kind who carry the weight of silence longer than most people carry their own name. I've known a lot of soldiers. Some made it into the news, some didn't. But the best ones, the real ones, they lived between the headlines. I never made it general. Never even made captain. I walked with a limp by 30 and lived off VA checks longer than I'd like to admit. But today I stood among them, not because of rank, not because of protocol, but because of loyalty. I tucked the program back into my coat and stood, slow, careful, like a man who knows his legs have 1 more mile left, maybe 2, and is damned if he won't use every inch of it. And as I turned toward the bus stop, something strange happened. A car pulled up. Government plates. Black sedan. The back window rolled down and a voice called softly, "Need a lift, Mr. Briggs?" It was the young sergeant from the gate. His tone had changed. No more clipped orders. No more blank stares. Now, there was something behind his words. Something I hadn't heard in a long time. Understanding. I paused, studying him for a beat. Then I nodded once and opened the door. "Yeah," I said, easing into the back seat. "I think I've walked enough for one day." The car that took me away from the military cemetery rolled slowly through the pale gray Virginia afternoon. I didn't say a word during the first stretch of the ride. Neither did the young soldier driving. Perhaps he understood. Some silences aren't meant to be filled. I looked out the window. Rows of white headstones receded behind us, steady like the fading heartbeat of a generation. I wondered, how many of those lying back there had once been stopped at the gate like I was today? How many had slipped away in silence, carrying with them a time of fire and smoke that no one bothered to remember? I wasn't angry at anyone, just felt sorrow. For a country that sometimes becomes too busy to remember those who built it with blood and bone. The young soldier dropped me off at the roadside bus stop. Just before I stepped out, he hesitated and asked, "Sir, you and General Decker, were you close?" I looked him straight in the eyes and nodded. We weren't just comrades. We were men who trusted each other with our lives. He bowed his head, said nothing more. But his eyes were no longer the same as when he looked at me this morning like I was just some old man. Now there was something else in them. Something I thought I'd lost long ago. Recognition. The vehicle pulled away, leaving me alone under the crisp sky. I sat down on a weathered wooden bench, my hand brushing over the funeral program still in my coat pocket. On the last page was a small line I hadn't noticed before. "We do not forget those who stood beside you on the battlefield. Though their names may not appear, their spirits are always here." I smiled. Not because it was perfectly true, but because someone had tried to remember. And that, though small, was enough to ease something heavy inside me. I looked toward the hill, in the distance where the flag-draped coffin still rested in silence. No more ceremonies, no more bugle. But I knew. Deck's spirit was still there, not beneath the flag, but in the hearts of those still breathing. Because we, old soldiers, the unnamed ones not carved into stone, are still here, not needing medals, not seeking monuments. We ask only for one thing: don't forget each other. Don't let our stories fade into the sad epilogues of speeches. Don't let retired soldiers stand at the edge of the very things they bled to protect. And if someone ever asks, "Did you go to a general's funeral?" I'll answer, "No. I came to say goodbye to a man who once dragged me out of hell, who split his last ration with me, and who kept his promise to a brother in arms, when no one else was watching. And that's the last thing I want to say." If one day you see an old soldier standing quietly before a grave holding a wilted flower, don't ask who he buried there. Ask who he lived to remember. Because sometimes the dead don't need to be named. They only need the living not to forget who they were. There are names that will never be etched into grand monuments. There are medals that will never be pinned before cameras. But there are people, like Walter Briggs, who still step past the cold lines of ceremony just to say a farewell that never should have needed permission. Because honor doesn't lie in rank. Respect doesn't require a guest list. And one timely salute can change how a whole generation is remembered. If you've ever wondered who still stands after the war, the answer is they do, the ones who never really left. This is not just a story about a funeral. It is a reminder that sometimes true history isn't written in books. It lives in the hearts of those who never forget.